So you saw that podcast, that clip I showed you earlier in the show, Jonathan McWhorter with Glenn Loury. It's from the Glenn Show. He is a podcast. This guy is totally brilliant and says some very compelling things that very few are saying, but I don't know. There's a lot there, folks. So here he is back when he was a Harvard professor. And he was, at the time, living a bit of a double life. He had one of the most prestigious jobs in academia, but in the culture that he was running in, well, guess what? Being a Harvard professor wasn't that cool, and he was living a different type of life at night. Now, he's totally fixed all of that, but I think his experience speaks to, well, some issues that we could all use some insight on. Glenn Loury, Merton P. Stoltz professor of economics at Brown University. Welcome to Newsmax. How are you?
Doing well, Greg. Thank you.
Sir, forgive me. I'm trying to cram a 30-minute podcast into about 20 seconds, but you spoke about your life in a very revealing way that I think a lot of folks have no idea that there might be pressure on somebody like you who has the best job in the world, Harvard University, to somehow prove his credibility with the community by doing other things.
Well, let me just first note it was a long time ago. It was 35 years ago. But yeah, I was at Harvard and I was also living a double life out on the streets. And as I look back on it, it's pretty clear to me that I was trying to prove my bona fides as being authentically Black somehow, or have not lost touch with my roots somehow. That's very unfair to the decent people who try to give me a good start in life. It's certainly not the whole picture of African-American culture, but there was something about my toxic masculinity and the way in which it expressed itself in my behavior that was very unhealthy. And I do think it's a piece of the story about Black life in America that needs to be confronted and rejected, frankly.
Why aren't people confronting it? Why isn't there a fuller conversation? You keep hearing about a conversation in America, and you spoke to Professor McWhorter, and this area that you're talking about, where somehow to maintain your status in the Black community, you've got to flirt with criminality, and that's going to impress a portion of the community. Why isn't that being confronted? Why won't people go there?
It's very difficult territory. People don't want to confirm the most critical and negative stereotypes about the community from people on the outside. So there's a kind of washing dirty linen in public, and you just don't do that. But I also think that if you name and acknowledge a problem, then you're bearing a responsibility to do something about it. And I think it's much easier to blame the maladies of African-American life, such as they are, on outside forces, systemic racism and so forth, than it is to acknowledge and accept responsibility for some of the pathology that lurks within our midst. We will not be the only Americans who have had pathological cultural problems that they've had to confront. I've heard that said about Italian and Irish and Jewish going back. But if you acknowledge it, you got to do something about it. And I think people are reluctant to man up and woman up.
So, Professor, listen, I'm white, I'm a conservative, and I know there's been kind of a certain receptiveness to this in conservative circles, me included. What Professor McWhorter was kind of frustrated over is that folks on the left are not willing to go there, are not willing to entertain these things and at least explore them and talk about them in an open way. And he fears that history will repeat itself once again. And it just doesn't sense any movement here. How do we change that? Is it changeable?
I think people are going to have to step out. Conservatives, of course, are going to call attention to these matters. I mean, with due respect to them, they're going to run the clips of the kids breaking through the windows and running off with things and of the crime and whatnot because of the way it cuts politically. The only people who can correct, they're not wrong to do so, but they're not going to have much of an impact. The only people who can really move the needle here are people who have the trust of the community. And that's why I said in that podcast from which you took an outtake that I'm disappointed in the leadership because, I even name names. I say the former president of the United States, Barack Obama, might have done a lot more to make clear the unacceptability of certain patterns of behavior in the community. he did start out in that vein. I saw that you had that Jesse Jackson outtake of threatening to, emasculate him and so forth. But that's the kind of pressure that people are under. No wonder they're reluctant to speak out, because a ton of bricks will fall on you if you do.
So there's Barack Obama. He's the most prestigious guy in the world for the left. You know what I mean? He's got his money. He's got his, and he won't go there. Do you think he changed his mind about these matters? Was he intimidated? He has nothing to, well, he's got a lot to lose. But why would a guy like that still be afraid to go there?
Here's what I think. I'll just be straight up and honest with you. I think President Obama calculated that he was going to be president for 8 years and that he was going to be former president for another 40 years after that. And I think the kind of cachet that he wanted to nurture and manage in his post-presidency precluded him from being fully an honest broker around these issues during his presidency. I know that's a very difficult thing for some people to hear. He's the only person, I think, in 2014 and 2015 who could have changed the narrative around these issues if he had taken the enormous credibility that he had with Black people and the enormous political weight that he carried with the country, and had stood apart from the woke crowd. But he didn't, and he still hasn't. And I regard that as a lost opportunity.
Do you sense, finally, that there are people looking at this moment and saying that this is, we've got to make a pivot, we've got to make a change, we got to speak about this differently, and we got to bring more people? You said earlier, more people have got to step up. Or is Professor McWhorter right that this is just kind of, we're not going to move the needle, we're kind of stuck, and we're going to have the same old conversation, the same articles from the New York Times, and the same drill, and not really make progress? How do we make the former happen?
I think we're stuck. I don't know what's going to happen, because there is the incalculable dimension of backlash here. I don't think the whole country is on board with the racial narratives that are being foisted. President Biden may well talk about systemic racism, but I'm quite sure that there are many swing districts throughout this country where people are not persuaded, white people are not persuaded that they are irredeemably racist. But I think that the media, the cultural establishment, the academic institutions, the arts and entertainment, Hollywood and so forth, I think they are full bore behind the white supremacy, done us wrong, America has its knee on the necks of Black people narrative, and I don't see it changing.
Professor, we'll see about that. We'll see about that. And voices like yours are very important. Quite frankly, sir, I just recently became acquainted with your work. It's amazing. And I encourage everybody to check out The Glenn Show, wherever you get your podcasts. And Professor Loury, we very much appreciate it, and hopefully to be continued.
Thank you very much, Greg. I appreciate it.
You bet.
Hey, I'm Rob Finnerty. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please join the conversation in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, too. Hit the bell icon to be alerted to breaking news. And remember, there's a whole lot more on Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news network. Newsmax TV, where real news for real people.